Thank you, Gil, for such a generous introduction. But thank you more for creating this opportunity to give closure to these 29 years of every Tuesday, at least during the academic season anyway. And it's obviously an interesting opportunity at this point to somehow recognize that what has happened over the past 30 years, and that what I subjected many of you to, also took place in Chicago, because it became essentially the intellectual foundation that underlies the design ethos of the practice, and that and the teaching of those two studios essentially coincided. What was it? Well, it was really the search for both the reasons and the forms with which to root architecture into context as integral contributions in an ongoing cultural continuum. In a sense, I promoted in Milwaukee what I practiced in Chicago, which was really finding the logic to building form as a conscious endeavor to understand the arrangements of the parts, their structure, their size, their shape, their relationships, all comprising a coherent whole. In short, building typology. Now, I want to summarize for you the origins of this idea. Subsequent to that, I want to basically summarize how I conceive of it and use it in the practice and the teaching of design, and then end with a selection of projects from the practice that illustrate its application and its relevance. I introduce you to an image from Diderot's Encyclopedia, late 18th century, where, in fact, all of, if I can call Western culture, was seeking to understand how to organize recurring attributes, features that were observable, evidence, and affinities into usable constructs. And in this particular image, out of hundreds that he made, you see the kind of curiosity that existed at this point. There's a bunch of guys sharpening knives. I mean, that's a sort of important act at this point. Now, the interesting part about it is that that kind of curiosity generated scientific inquiry. In the natural sciences, the Swedish botanist Linnaeus, an inspiration for Gil's daughter's name, is credited with the classification of world plants, insects, if not all of life. And it all had to do really with trying to somehow understand and grasp that were distinct, significant characteristics that could be indeed identified. And it's therefore not surprising, therefore, that if we go into what happened at the Royal Academy in France under the guidance of a gentleman by the name of Antoine Quatremer de Quincy, architecture, like botany, was engaged as a class of observable, repeated configurations and replicable geometrical orders. Implicit in this perception of buildings was the empirical fact that architecture, in effect, could be typified. And if you see here, for example, in a street in Genoa, a bunch of palaces, one beside the other one with elevations, that there's a certain kind of consistency about the idea of a building with a hole in it. And that whether or not you do that in palaces or whether you do it in villas by Palladio, which is essentially another group of those images at this point, you could describe buildings by the way that they ordered their plans, they ordered their structural systems, they ordered their volumetric organizations, they ordered their enclosure systems, the way they were indeed wrapped, and they ordered their contextual strategy, i.e. how the buildings occupied the ground. Now what's interesting is that de Quincy was very savvy. He warned everybody at that time that typology was not to convey images or static literal forms, but to serve only as a grammar of antecedents, and that's the critical word, antecedents of concepts embodied in the physical events of buildings. Therefore, he looked upon them as mutable constructs, linking form, reason, use, always subject to reinterpretation and transformation, i.e., they were not fixed ideas, but they were indeed mutable ideas, to fit multiple programs, to fit multiple functions, to fit multiple contexts. Now, regrettably, the 19th century didn't pay attention. And so you end up having maybe a competitor, but not necessarily so, by the name of Jean-Nicolas Durand at the École Polytechnique, who essentially allowed typology to deteriorate into stylistic visions. This comes out of his book, the pattern book that was published, that was used throughout the entire 19th century by architects throughout Europe and eventually in America. And that literally somehow just simply said, hey, a certain program looks like that. And so what you see here is multiple visions of what the heck he wanted to establish, even though there were remnants of typology as described by De Quincey at this point, in the presence of some of these plan orders at this point. So no wonder, essentially, that when modernism surfaced, with new building programs, with new technologies, with the liberation from masonry, and also with not having to cope with gravity and compression, modern architects quickly discarded Durand's pattern books. They just threw them out, rightfully so, because indeed they were felt constrained by the very nature of what I call the subject matter that was basically illustrated in this case. And of course, they basically then took refuge in a new rhetoric, attributing building form only and merely to functional and operational demands. Now, these are unfair images to give you, but I'm going to use them anyway. Modernism became a new formal determinism, almost religious techno-aesthetic doctrine intended to be equally valid in Boston, in Buenos Aires, in Barcelona, and in Bangalore. It didn't make any difference what the climate was. It didn't make any difference what the social conditions were. It was applicable across the world. And since the need to examine antecedents was no longer perceived as essential, the education of architects, and much of it continues today, by the way, discarded any normative ideas of formal and compositional literacy. There is, however, an exception. Well, there were several exceptions, but the most critical exception, I beg your pardon, I mean, here's the image, essentially, by Ludwig Hellmesheimer, basically, of describing architecture as it should be anywhere in the world at this point. The exception comes in these four doodles by one Charles-Édouard Généré, better known as Corbu. He left us these four amazing sketches for the cover of his Œuvre Complète in 1935, and what he did, rather amazingly, is he typified four of his houses. At the top, Maison La Roche. Sorry, right there. Then he shows essentially next to that the Villa Garches, which is 1927. His contributions at Weissenhof, 1929, and eventually the Villa Savoy at Poissy. You probably can't read the sketches because they're so blurred, but they're insightful comments that convey building volumes as types, an inherent logic that juxtaposes memory, reason resulting from these formal preconceptions that are then adapted to programmatic demands of a house, accommodating daily life of the inhabitants, as well as some of the contextual conditions of the site. What Corbu started to tell us, which I think is important and I learned rather quickly, is that he's talking about elements that are being connected. He's talking about Platonic forms that are basically being maintained as a unit. He's talking about platonic forms that are eroded in this case, where you actually come in and carve out parts and pieces. And he does the same thing, obviously, in the Villa Savoy. He's an exception to the problem, in a sense, because what we end up finding is that having thrown out the baby with the bathwater, which is really what modernists did at that point, normative formal composition was really not present. And what began to happen was, in fact, that they had to be embarrassed, if I can put it that way. And they were embarrassed by what they did after World War II. They went into areas that had been bombed out and produced this level of anomie at this point. Placing buildings in the landscape surrounded by unassigned open space, yes, intended to provide adequate sunlight and promote health, but the Brits, in their wisdom, referred to it by the acronym SLOAP, S-L-O-A-P, space left over after planning. And this has exposed really the need to reconsider fitting and merging buildings without disruption into existing settings, i.e. European cities. The interesting part about this, of course, is that it engendered in the 60s, early 60s, a kind of movement that was primarily based in Italy, referred to as the neo-razionale, the neo-rationals. But it had its advocates in Germany and in England, in Luxembourg. And you end up finding, interestingly enough, architects who are revolting from the kind of, what can I say, sort of impositions of this modernism. A guy like Jim Sterling, for example, goes into St. Andrews, Scotland, finds an old house that happens to have two little side houses at this point, and in the process weaves in an entirely new art center into the process. That's one exception. The other exception ends up being a guy like Al Rossi. Here he has a commission in Berlin in an area that was bombed out, but he basically builds buildings that to a large extent follow the traditions of the 1920s and prior to the 1920s, 1890s, of building buildings right up against the street side of the basic same height, maintaining the same kind of street fabric. In a place like Austria, again, that basically suffered from the kind of destruction, you end up having essentially a guy like Rob Creer understanding his antecedents and rediscovering types, recurring formal constraints that could be reinterpreted and transformed into modern requirements. Their work, in my view, demonstrated that architectural form was neither a single artistic event nor a nostalgic replication of or mimicry of the past, but a way to merge into and extend the urban fabric. Now, it's rather interesting to then say, well, so what do we do at this point? Well, there's no better way for an architect to understand how building form responds to a context than confronting a totally different climate, a completely unfamiliar and uniquely restrictive resources, and also a completely unfamiliar culture. There's a danger, however, and the danger is best illustrated by something that we have all admired considerably, and we fall prey at this point to imagery and again to mimicking by emulating indigenous building forms, in this case the South Pacific, by a very reputable architect using structural components fabricated in Europe with timber harvested in Central Africa. There you have it. The extent is essentially of disregarding where and when something happens. Now, I had the good fortune of teaching undergraduate studios at WashU and combined my efforts with a colleague by the name of Ed Baum when we at one point effectively revolted and said, let's stop teaching design the way we were taught design, which was to basically take us to the deep end of the pool, throw us in and say, swim, with no other instruction and no other direction at that point. So we began to teach design by looking at how we could communicate with our students those aspects that indeed help to engender building form. It all started, and then I had the good fortune, as Gil mentioned, of being seduced by SOM in Chicago to come and spend a sabbatical to begin with. And at that point, I had to confront the reality of typology. By looking at a project I was assigned to do, which was to design a 30,000 student university campus in Helwan, Egypt, south of Cairo. And I then had to sort of say, well, what in the world is going on in that place? If you look at the map of the world, and you basically look at the fact that we have this whole area in red, as well as, of course, this area and a piece of it down here, a little bit in the Atacama in Peru, and obviously in the American Southwest. What I was interested was this part of the world. That part of the world is best described as desert. It extends all the way from southern Spain to through northern Africa, the Middle East, into northern India. And what appears to be initially unsurmountable extreme constraints, when this looked at further, produced what I would describe it as a coherent, even poetic building order. This is in Yemen. This is a town basically in the middle of the desert in which people have developed a way to live comfortably in the worst climatic conditions, in which people have developed an architecture that comes out of the resources available to them without having to import stuff, except for perhaps some wood, by the way, which they didn't have, and in which the climate, culture, and resources are addressed by a building form that transcends the extreme limitations. A building grammar that constantly undergoes reinterpretation and transformation while always being a part of the context. And what's important about this is that it takes on different forms. Here you go to a place in what is now Tunisia at this point, and you can see it now not in tall 6-story buildings, but in 2- and 3-story buildings. And you can see the fabric effectively as a form of constantly being used by everybody as a basis to satisfy their demands for shelter. What I was fortunate to do at that time was to basically seek to sort of set up rules of design for what we were going to be doing. And some of you have seen these hanging in my office. They're still around. It says that clearly, when the sun dictates life, building forms and urban fabrics must limit exposure and engender shade, while at the same time have the mass to retain temperature. And what you then get are effectively plans, and in this case you see it, the whole idea of the courtyard plan. Courtyard being a place to exhaust the building at night when the temperatures drop, and the towers that are connected to it are the places to bring that cold air down into the building at that point. You produce a building system that fundamentally minimizes the amount of surface exposure, which is only basically the roof at this point. You introduce volumetric assemblies, as I said, that induce natural ventilation, that you have building enclosures, as you can see in this case, that are small perforations that reduce glare, and that result in an urban fabric that I would like to describe it as residences and institutions and palaces of worship, places of worship, continuous ground within which are carved figural open spaces. So there's a kind of reversal that occurs in these situations that produces something that indeed is a set of ground rules to design. Now, we use this, and we use this rather blatantly in the design of this university campus south of Cairo in Helwan. What you have is a replicable building order where sun and light control and ventilation are supported by cellular massing of volumes, enclosed by screened and punctured heavy masonry walls, within which people can take refuge from the intemperate desert, while at the same time not only accommodating the traditional set pieces of the culture, but entirely new programs in a modern university. So you have student housing, for example, in what are effectively 5-story buildings with a hole in them. You have a student center, dining facility that again is made up around the idea of courtyards. You have faculty housing, which is basically not too dissimilar to what I showed you in Tunis. And then you have classroom buildings. And each one of these essentially is a faculty at this point. And the classroom buildings basically provide the same kind of attitude that says, hey, we're going to harness the cold air that comes across from the Peloponnesus from Greece, goes over the Mediterranean, and is able to come down into the desert once the sun sets. And that's why the Egyptians were able to basically quarry granite, because they're able to use ice that was formed at night. And that same amount of cold air can indeed be brought into the buildings, and the buildings become like refrigerators. They behave under thermal mass. They close up during the daytime, and then you basically throw back the BTUs onto it from the occupancy of the people. All of the administrative functions occur in that location. Those are athletic facilities, and we've got soccer fields and playing fields, all basically step down so that they can reuse the water from one as it basically drains from the other one. What you have, and what you get as a result, is a set of building assemblies, and by the way, this is a model of phase 1 of construction at this point, where the building assemblies are based on that ubiquitous plan of the courtyard, related structural systems, related cellular building volumes and perforated building enclosures, and the contextual imperative to abut buildings in the gender-shaded networks. Typology contributed both the reason and the form with which to root the architecture in a context. It sought an order in order to plans. It sought a structural order in terms of what we did in those cases, to the massing of volumes, to the enclosure of envelopes, and how to occupy the site. So there are indeed sort of 5 variables that engender that building order, and those 5 variables clearly can be best illustrated by what I'll show you next, which are a bunch of diagrams that have been done mostly by students. Here are plant types. I describe the world as having only 3 kinds of plants. There are nodal plants, those things that basically are built around something, whether it's a hole or a solid, that can indeed be circumferential or they could be radial. There are linear plants that are either layered or they are indeed spinal. And then there are, and here Dick disagrees with me, what I call field plants, which are basically made up of the same repetitive element. In this case, Lou Kahn's wonderful gallery in Fort Worth. Then there are structural systems. And the structural systems, leaving aside those things that are basically shells and membranes, which engender their own form, by the way, by the very nature of what they're doing, we have bearing wall systems, we have frame systems, we have column and slab systems. And you end up seeing essentially the order really being dictated by how the system is built. Now, when we look at volumes, the interesting part, as I started before to describe, was that we do have figural volumes, which maintain their sort of Platonic validity. There are indeed what I call eroded or exploded Platonic volumes, the Art Center at Harvard by Corbeau is precisely that. It's sort of the cube that eventually developed elephant ears on the outside. Then we have what I describe as elemental volumes. And there are two kinds of those, as you'll see later. But what we're really talking about is identifying each of the functions in terms of its volume composition and whether they're gasketed or intersected. And last and least, again, are the cellular systems. What's important to describe here, and of course, is the fact that this doesn't just stop here. It keeps on going in terms of the fact that we can describe skin systems. And the skin systems say, hey, we punch walls and walls. We infill frames. We bypass the skin. We bypass the structure with the skin. These are indeed examples of stuff that's built. You know, this is my stuff I'll show later. This happens to be Corbeau at Chandigarh. This happens to be a German building in Berlin at this point. Now, I take at this point a small digression. Because in order to talk about the fifth variable, the variable of how we use context as a way of giving form, I first have to introduce you to a friend of mine's rather perverse commentary on architecture. He's a Danish architect who basically goes into American magazines, cuts out all kinds of images, and then pastes them up. And this is his wonderful commentary of landing a building anywhere without any reference to climate, without any reference to physical characteristics, without any reference to relationships between context and its surroundings, and you drop the preconceived object into sight without considering its formal responsibilities, which a building must assume in order to fulfill more than just the user or client's program. How buildings engage a context, how they occupy a site, is more than just simply centering a structure within the proper boundaries and required zoning setbacks. And it's at that point where it's important to somehow introduce the idea that, yeah, you can do centering, and sometimes centering is perfectly okay. Here's a government ministry complex of 8 ministries in the middle of the countryside, which was basically designed around the idea that everybody had to come from a parking lot around the perimeter and walk this minimum amount of distance. Centering is an option at this point. But there's also the responsibility at some time or another, like in this case, where a building has to confront the world. It has to basically seek a kind of presence. Or a building has to basically become a wrapper that basically surrounds a taller building because the buildings around the context are only this high and you don't want this thing to occur right on the edges at this point. Context then also engenders options that have to do with, to a certain extent, sort of papering the whole thing over. In this case, there's a site, and the whole idea of the building basically takes on its shape and its configuration from the perimeter by covering it completely. Here's a case where the building has to do more than that. The building has to provide the ability of walking through it, i.e. the whole aspect essentially that you have connection through the site by other functions, while at the same time engendering an open space where people can gather and have all kinds of demonstrations, while at the same time being a building that confronts the world as a public building at this point. And lastly and not least, here using a building by Jim Sterling, of something that he basically understood fully because he saw it really happening in the Renaissance, and that's embedding into the whole area a function like the courtyard that basically occurs on that particular site. What I find important to remind you of, it doesn't matter whether you have an aggressive helicopter with people on machine guns dropping the building. You can do it gently with a balloon as well. It's important that we recognize that these are coarse reference, that they can be used singly or in combination, and that they provide something that reasserts, first of all, that architecture does not materialize without literacy, that designing is a continuous process of reinterpretation and transformation of precedents, not as nostalgic parodies of the past, but as ongoing mutations in the built landscape. Now let me share with you how we practiced these ideas in Chicago and promoted them in Milwaukee. And I say we because this is not a solo act. This is an act that basically has required a lot of heads, a lot of hands, a lot of dedication. And at this point in time, I think it's important that I credit, first of all, Kathy Hess, my partner, who has been doing this for the last 30 years with me. And then, at the risk of missing some of you who are maybe in this room, let me go through a list of the people who basically suffered through this thing. Joe Hanoski, Greg Lesher, Michael Maher, Kurt Baumgarten, Chris Hale, Caitlin Driscoll, Tom Mazzina, Darren Hoppe, Rose Hilbert, Gary Yeager, Len Lopate, Mark Dabrowski, Jeff Piet, Kaito, Andrew Haynes, Kasha Golick, Dylan Parker, Paula Bowman, Marley Gast, David Lang, Chris Michaud, Justin Lodel, Kevin Bonderberg, Julia Budzik, and then my two illustrious colleagues, Jim Dicker and Gil Snyder. I am going to show you half a dozen or 5 projects. I'm going to start with this one here, which is basically referred to as the Town Hall in Leesburg, Virginia. It was a design competition that we won. And it was a competition, really interestingly enough, run by Jeff Olswang and Larry Witzling of the school at that time. And what you have is a ratty, leftover backyards that became a surface parking lot, onto which the town wanted to create a town hall, a parking garage of 400 cars. Well, what we did is we basically were able to dismember the program into pieces, and the pieces essentially became what I describe in my typology as an elemental assembly. It happens to have a body of an office building, basically a council chamber, a parking garage that is embedded, if you want to put it, into the middle of the block, covered up by additional retail and office space that could be rented out, punctured by 2 pathways that basically went through the garage and led you to the main street of town at this point. To hide all of this stuff, we basically introduced an arcade that ran through the whole block at that point. This is a colonial town, 17th century town. The idea behind it was to produce a brick building with metal roofs. And if you basically see this today and see how it got built, the only thing that hasn't happened yet at this point is the commercial space that's to be rented. We created a world that basically provided an confronting, symbolic place that says Town Hall. We edged the street and repaired it as an urban condition. We buried a nasty parking garage of 400 cars, and we were able to connect it elegantly through the rest of the town in such a way that the whole thing got restored. And as Gail suggested, it was indeed lauded by a lot of people at this point. We have, and that's the front yard, if I can call it that at this point. Shamelessly borrowed from Jefferson's Charlotte. You know, I mean, without any compulsion about it. Yeah, it's smaller, but it's fundamentally the same idea at this point. You see here what happens in the building. The building happens to be a single loaded corridor building that basically opens up onto the courtyard, reduces the windows to the north side at this point, and ends up essentially, you know, providing effectively a kind of response to the conditions that it was asked to do in the context at that point. There you see the corridor, there you see the council chamber. Second project, another competition. This is one of the first ones that we did in Korea. If you look at the site, it's a park that happens to occur in beautiful view of a bridge across an inlet from the ocean at this point. And so it becomes essentially the idea of a museum for contemporary art that is basically, we could have put it anywhere we wanted to at this point. We said, hey, let's put it at the back of the park. Let's make it into something that basically confronts you when you come across the bridge. It again, without any shame, borrows from Lou Kahn's Fort Worth galleries at this point, except that in this case we knew that we couldn't bring the light in from the top, so we brought it in from clear stories on either side. And we engendered roof terraces for sculpture at the upper level at this point. And what you see here on the right, this kind of what I describe it as commentary that is unique to this thing, is the fact that there's a shoreline on the right of this thing, which basically created the same kind of geometry at this point. So it becomes really kind of cellular composition that is spiked through by a space that holds it all together at this point. And the result is this, which happens to have won the competition, and then we were fortunate enough to basically build it. The important thing about this is, again, that we are indeed conscious and intentionally looking at formative ideas. And those formative ideas essentially are the ones that are contributing to the whole gestalt in this case. There you see the plans, the reading essentially of those galleries, which again basically are borrowed from Kahn at this point, except that in this case we pulled them apart. You can walk under them at the bottom at this point because the legs go over it, so they become a connecting device across the site so people can go from one side to the other one. And there you see the galleries. This project is a unique event, again another competition that we happen to have won, but regularly never were able to build because the sponsors of the competition were never funded. It was a piece of land, as you can see, weird shape as it comes at this point, that was owned by about 100 fishermen, tiny little places, 3 meters by 3 meters at this point. They formed a cooperative and had the brilliant idea that they were going to build a building which not only contained their operations for selling raw fish and raw sushi and packaging seaweed, but they were going to create an entertainment palace for the Hyundai guys that worked across the street. And so you end up having essentially a world which we described endearingly as a working class entertainment palace. And it consists essentially of a slab that has intersected into it in a kind of elemental way again, a cylinder and a half thing at this point, plus a shard of circulation and toilets. And it has the weirdest program in it at this point. It has a bank, what is called a wedding chapel, which they rent out to weddings at this point. It happens to have a kind of projection imagery control. It has all of this restaurant function. Then it has raw fish restaurants in the floor. Eventually it has bowling alleys. It has a karaoke bar. It has a swimming health center. And at the top of the whole building, it happens to have a place for an aquarium and a seal show. We would have loved to have built this thing, but regrettably it didn't happen. So, but we do have indeed the experience at this point of having fundamentally created a world, as you can see right here, that really took advantage of that literacy that we basically relied on, of taking elements and basically intersecting them with each other, which is really what constructivists did in Russia and that we learned from them in the past at this point. There you can see it in section. Last and not least, no, there's one more at this point. This is a project in Seoul. We entered the competition and didn't get anything. So sometimes you lose and sometimes you don't. But this was a building for the National Tax Administration, and it basically occurred off the main drag of town right here, right on axis to the end of the system at this point. And it was surrounded by little buildings all around it, so we said, given the program, that we really shouldn't be building this thing up against the side. We should wrap it in something that mediates the street from the tower. And so that's exactly what we ended up doing, and produced a building in this case, which of course happens to be clad in masonry at this point, and happens to be also the place where all the public comes to for services. And then behind it is where all the bureaucrats sit, and it so happens to be that it faces southwest, and the only way to deal with this was with a double skin at this point. So you have indeed a glass double skin, ventilated double skin that cleans up the building. And interestingly enough, it becomes a building that literally occurs right on axis with the axis from the main street of town at this point. And you can see the plan in this case, and then the space between the buildings, which is basically where you create the kind of gap between the two. This is the last project we did in Korea. It is a town hall in a place called Sacheon on the west coast. And it comes off as a place that had to do all kinds of things. It had to clearly provide what they described as a gathering place for the whole town facing south. It had to provide the frontality of what I describe it as formal presence in the building. And it had to provide access through the site to a nature preserve. Now, part of the, what I call iconography that we were lucky to inherit, is that in Korea there are certain expected pieces that are understood. The bureaucracy lives in one place. The public service people who basically deal with the contract, with the public, occur in another piece. And then there is the place where the council people take refuge, or whatever it is at this point. Those three pieces became the compositional devices that we then turned around and created on top of a big canopy, thereby creating what you describe it as the open space that they wanted, with parking in this case occurring on the two sides and under the building at that point. There you have it. Interestingly enough, again, interesting problems that arise when you make certain decisions. Once again, we have a facade that faces west. Well, what did we do in this case? Well, we turned it into a single loaded corridor, which happens to be a place where not people sit, that are able essentially to control the climate in that area and allow the offices to occur on the other side. They have, however, the ability of looking over everything onto the sea, which is, I think, equally important. They have the ability of raising this whole thing by being able to walk under it to get to the nature preserve. And then they have all the other stuff essentially easily accessible from both ends as part of the service. This building then becomes really sort of the prima donna of the whole place as a kind of event, isolated and recognized for its symbolic role. And this is it. And if you recognize the rear end of this person, here you see the plans of this, walking underneath it, and then the council chamber. Sorry, once again, here I am with my clients, who happen to be all architects, for whom I was indeed working, because they indeed were the ones who entered the competition with our design proposal and built the project at this point. This project is perhaps a lesson really in restraint. We were given an existing building that's what I describe it as a multi-useless building. You know? It happens to have a place that is a worship space as well as a social center, as well as everything else, plus a few classrooms. And it's a congregation of a church west of Chicago in Glen Ellen that, by the very nature of what they've been doing over the years, really wanted to have a new sanctuary, wanted to have a sanctuary which maintained some of the qualities of what they did before, wanted to have a small chapel, and they saw the chapel really as a kind of element that presented them to the world. And what you see here is really the kind of, after many alternatives were studied, the idea essentially of producing an extension of the existing building as a kind of boomerang that contains essentially the new sanctuary as a circular space, and it has essentially at the end of the entrance the chapel, which is a little glass cylinder with a driveway that provides a courtyard and a welcoming entrance piece at this point. The model tells you something about this, which is really important. There's a kind of entrance to a narthex to the sanctuary with all of the standard criteria essentially of producing, in this case, once again, elemental pieces, and this is really the critical aspect at this point, that are woven together to produce this kind of a world. Right now, this is awaiting construction, but what has happened is that this has gotten built so far. The chapel is behind it at that point. There's a plan of it, and this is what has gotten built so far. That is, the courtyard has gotten built in typical fashion. Small congregations like this take a while before they can collect the funds to do it. The most critical thing to these people was the fact that they ought to be able to see each other in worship. And that's why, after going through a whole set of options of seating arrangements, they selected, they selected essentially this nodal order at this point. Last, in this case, happens to be what Gil mentioned as the kind of poetic justice that has basically followed me for 20-some years, having to arrive at this place every Tuesday. And we were fortunate enough to basically go after this project. And the project essentially becomes an interesting project because it says what you're really having to do is to replace this crumbling shelter, while at the same time resolving two critical aspects of this thing. One is the fact that you have 5 tracks and 3 platforms which are all illegal in terms of egress requirements, and are all illegal in terms of ADA criteria. And what really needs to happen at some point, another one as well, is once you have the ability of 50,000 square feet of roof, you might as well use it in such a positive way that you can actually create photovoltaic conditions, but more importantly, that you have diesel engines that run through this whole place and that really need to get ventilated. Now, does typology play any role in this thing? Yeah, it does essentially, because essentially what we had to do in this case say is we cannot change the footings. We have to build on the same column spacing. We then have to find a roof system that is light enough and at the same time airy enough to allow us to ventilate the place, to provide photovoltaics, and to bring in daylight. And then we have to find a way of getting rid of all these violations in the code, which says that you have to basically satisfy ADA criteria, you have to satisfy the egress requirement that says that you have to empty this place with 5 loaded trains in less than 6 minutes. This is something called NFPA 130. And we worked around this whole issue, and what we ended up producing is a world that, how can I describe it? That embeds a transportation gadget, a circulation gadget, into the shed to take care of all of the egress conditions and access conditions. So there's indeed a mezzanine, which had to supplement the tunnel, which in this case happens to exist at this point, because the tunnel is far from meeting the requirements of egress at this point. It has escalators, it's got stairs, it does all that stuff, and then as you can see above it at this point, it brings in daylight, and the trusses are designed so that the daylight occurs between the trusses. It has the ventilating shafts, and it's the thing that has been used in the poster at this point, where you can see this whale, the blue whale as we call it in the office at this point, sitting in the middle of this white skin, that clearly is detached from the structure. So the structure has its own life. The skin basically bypasses it and clips onto it. And then inside of it, it ends up having that device with the existing tunnel at this point. On the roof, because of the nature of what we did with the trusses, we were able to install the photovoltaics directly in the slope at this point and produce 75 kW, which is about twice as much as what is needed at this point. There you can see the circulation device at this point. Looking at it from the other side, and then looking at the pieces that are really part of the whole system. Let me end with a contrarian's diagnosis. I go back to my Danish friend over here and show you his analogy, graphic analogy of the state of architecture today, which he equates to being similar to the biblical Tower of Babel, where we live in an age that thrives on celebrity, that prefers consumer-motivated idiosyncrasy over anonymous and unaffected, that seeks for startling over the subtle, that clearly favors novelty for its own sake. It appears to enjoy the audio and visual noise that proliferates all around us. As one who has spent the last 50 years designing, and I'm not necessarily pulling my white hair as an excuse, my contention is that novelty for its own sake is as fleeting and insubstantial as hair or hat styles and other consumer-motivated stimuli. And that the continual search for whimsical irregularity in the form of buildings only reflects a kind of insecurity that presumes freedom of expression requires demonizing anything that is ordered and the defying of convention. Remember, to those of you who suffered through my studio, when everything is extraordinary, it eventually becomes ordinary. Now, the current surface imagery of fragmentation, immateriality, dislocation, disintegration, even when supported by the rhetoric of philosophy or literary criticism, and the fact that technology lets us build anything, anywhere, no matter what it is, cannot overcome the simple fact that designing never starts from scratch. Unlike birds, weaver birds particularly in this case, to whom building a nest out of grass and saliva is an instinctive act, an architect confronting a site, a program, a building budget, and a blank sheet of paper better have a literacy of precedence in order to engender and support intuition. The ongoing stylistic climate will argue that literacy thwarts invention and arrogantly dismisses as a continuous process of transformation the interpretation and reinterpretation of accumulated knowledge. I counter with the fact that architecture is learned. The required knowledge of facts, of procedures, of standards, and the assembly into a coherent whole that is not nascent in us, simply awaiting the inspiration from the muses. And here my Danish friend shows us precisely what is meant by that. Let's remember that the noble savage, and this is a wonderful piece of architecture essentially done by Indians in the Orinoco. That fictive model for much of modern thought, inspired by Romanticism, those people didn't build out of instinct. So-called primitive humans learned to build, if not architecture, in ways remarkably similar to ours. They acquire knowledge for the purposes and processes of building form, from their surroundings, from their cultural milieu, by observation, by emulation, by instruction, and by practice. Last and not least, my contention is that architecture has provided typology as a reassurance that designing in architecture is an endeavor that adopts standards, skills, patterns from the world around us, that emulates proven models as mutable constructs that are worthy of attentive translation. And that, like my colleague's image here, says to us, get on your hands and knees and fix the carpet. We should not fear or presume that this is going to engender an absence of innovation, but welcome it as a means to demystify design, as well as the foundation and intellectual discipline worthy of a seat in academia and as a professional literacy, in lieu of what I call unsupported sophistry or stylistic novelty. I've been exactly an hour. I invite you to, if you're interested, to look at this further. If you go to hannoweber.com, the website, there's a book under publications that basically is called On Building Typology. It's free. You can actually download it. I don't think you can copy it in terms of paper, but you can certainly download it on your drives, and you're welcome to have it. Thank you.